Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. My name is Alex, and I'm your host for today's episode. Episode 29 in our Charles Manson series. Imagine this. You're sitting in an airplane at 30,000 feet. The flight attendant has just served lunch. A businessman in 12C is reading his newspaper. A young mother is trying to quiet her crying baby. Everything seems normal. Then you hear it, the sound of footsteps rushing down the aisle, panicked voices, and then silence. What you don't know is that you've just become a pawn in the most audacious escape plan ever conceived by the Manson family. A plan so shocking, so calculated, that it would make their previous crimes look like child's play. The year was 1971. Charles Manson and his followers had been convicted for the brutal Tate LaBianca murders that had terrorized Los Angeles 2 years earlier. The world thought it was over. The monsters were caged. Justice had been served. But Prosecutor Vincent Buliosi knew better. He understood that for true believers like the Manson family, conviction was just the beginning of another chapter. Even as the trials continued, something sinister was brewing on the streets of Los Angeles. Every day, like clockwork, young women with shaved heads and X's carved into their foreheads would gather on the corner of Temple and Broadway. They called it their Vigil. Buliosi called it what it really was, a war council. These weren't just grieving followers. These were soldiers planning their next move. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a seemingly minor case. 4 of Manson's girls had been caught trying to silence a key witness named Barbara Hoyt. Their method? Slipping her an LSD-laced hamburger in Hawaii. It sounds almost comical now, but the intent was deadly serious. Here's what's chilling about this case. The justice system essentially gave them a slap on the wrist. 90 days in county jail, 75 days with time served. And the girl who actually poisoned the hamburger? She simply didn't show up for sentencing and walked free. The message was clear. The system was treating these people like common criminals. But Vincent Buliosi knew they were something far more dangerous. True believers who would stop at nothing to free their leader. While the girls were planning on the street corner, another drama was unfolding in the courtroom. Charles Tex Watson, the man who had personally carried out most of the murders, was finally going on trial. Watson was different from the others. Where Manson was charismatic and the girls were devoted, Watson was calculating. He was the one who had cut the phone lines at the Tate residence. He was the one who had told Linda Kasabian to wipe the fingerprints off the knives. This wasn't the work of a mindless zombie. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But Watson had a strategy. He was going to play the victim, the poor brainwashed college boy who had fallen under Manson's spell. He dressed conservatively, kept his hair short, wore a tie and blazer. He wanted the jury to see him as their son, their brother, their boyfriend who had simply fallen in with the wrong crowd. There was just one problem. His eyes. They were glassy, unfocused, and he barely reacted to the testimony of witnesses who described his horrific crimes in detail. His mouth hung slightly open, giving him the appearance of being mentally challenged. Was this an act? Or had something inside him truly broken? The defense strategy was clear: diminished capacity. They would argue that Watson was so dominated by Manson, so psychologically damaged, that he couldn't be held fully responsible for his actions. If they could prove this, first-degree murder charges would be reduced to second-degree. The death penalty would be off the table. But Prosecutor Buliosi had spent months preparing for this moment. He knew Watson's game, and he was ready to expose it. Judge Adolph Alexander was supposed to be the impartial arbiter of justice. Instead, he became Buliosi's greatest obstacle. Alexander wasn't just any judge. He was a personal friend of Watson's defense attorney, Sam Bubrick. From the very beginning, it was clear which side Alexander favored. During jury selection, he casually remarked, "Many of us are opposed to the death penalty." When prosecution witnesses testified, he gave them incredulous, unbelieving looks. But when defense witnesses took the stand, He took industrious notes. All of this performed right in front of the jury. But it got worse. Alexander began cross-examining prosecution witnesses himself, essentially doing the defense's job for them. Imagine you're a prosecutor trying to prove your case, and the judge, the person who's supposed to be neutral, starts attacking your own witnesses. Finally, Buliosi had enough. In a rare moment of courtroom drama, he approached the bench and did something prosecutors almost never do. He confronted the judge directly. He reminded Alexander that this was a jury trial, not a court trial, and that his behavior was giving the jury the impression that he didn't believe the prosecution's witnesses. The intervention worked somewhat. Alexander cut down on his cross-examination, but his bias remained obvious. When the jury went out to deliberate, he didn't even send the exhibits to the jury room, something that happens automatically in every trial until Buliosi demanded it. And in private moments, Alexander referred to the defendant as Poor Tex. Near the end of the trial, Buliosi made a statement aimed at Judge Arnold that would never appear in the court record. "You're the biggest single obstacle to my obtaining a conviction of first-degree murder in this case." Despite fighting both the defense and the judge, Buliosi pressed on. When Watson took the stand, he played his role perfectly. He was the repentant sinner, the reformed killer, who now understood the horror of what he had done. He admitted to shooting and stabbing 6 victims, but claimed everything was Manson's idea. He was just following orders. Then Buliosi began his cross-examination. What happened next was like watching a mask fall away in real time. Under Buliosi's relentless questioning, Watson's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The slack-jawed, confused expression disappeared. His eyes sharpened. His responses became quick and calculated. The most chilling moment came when Buliosi got Watson to admit that he didn't think of the victims as people. They were just blobs to him. And when he described how the people at the Tate residence were running around like chickens with their heads cut off, Watson had smiled. This wasn't a damaged man reliving a traumatic experience. This was someone who took pleasure in recounting his victims' final moments of terror. Contrary to the findings of LAPD evidence expert Dwayne Wolfer, Watson identified the pair of red wire cutters found in Manson's dune buggy as the pair he had used to cut the Tate telephone wires that night. But Watson's testimony also revealed something new. For the first time, the public learned Manson's exact words on the night of the murders. Watson testified that Manson had pulled him aside and said, "Take the gun and knife and go up to where Terry Melcher used to live. Kill everybody in the house as gruesome as I could." The premeditation was clear. The intent was obvious, and despite the best efforts of his defense team and a clearly biased judge, Watson was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. But Watson's conviction was just one piece of a larger puzzle. The legal system was still dealing with other Manson family murders, and what happened in those courtrooms would be even more shocking. Susan Atkins, one of the Tate killers, pleaded guilty to the murder of Gary Hinman. Judge Raymond Choate didn't mince words when he sentenced her to life imprisonment, calling her a danger to any community who should spend her entire life in custody. Then came the trials for the murders of Gary Hinman and Donald Shorty Shea. Here's where things get truly bizarre. Shea's body had never been found, yet prosecutors managed to secure murder convictions against Charles Manson, Bruce Davis, and Steve Grogan anyway. Manson and Davis received life sentences, but Grogan's jury voted for death. Then something unprecedented happened. 2 days before Christmas 1971, Judge James Colts looked at this young man who had participated in brutal murder and made a decision that would shock the legal community. He reduced the death sentence to life imprisonment, saying that Grogan was too stupid and too hopped up on drugs to decide anything on his own. It was Manson, said the judge, who decided who lived or died. But it was Manson's behavior during his own trial that truly revealed the depths of his madness and manipulation. Angry that he wasn't allowed to represent himself, Manson stood up in court and made a confession that left everyone stunned. "I enter a plea of guilty. I chopped off Shorty's head." The judge refused to accept the plea. The next day, Manson withdrew it. It was all a game to him. Then, in another outburst that showed his true nature, Manson turned to the press gallery and issued a chilling threat. "I've told my people to start killing you." This wasn't just the ranting of a madman. This was a calculated message to his followers on the outside. Even from behind bars, even during his own trial, Manson was still giving orders. He was still in control. And he had chosen his attorney strategically. Irving Kanarek was known for drawing out trials with endless objections and delays. Manson knew that with Kanarek representing him, it would be a long trial, postponing his trip to San Quentin's death row. Every day of delay was another day his followers had to plan his escape. The Manson girls continued their vigil outside the courthouse, but something had changed. They were no longer just holding signs and chanting. They were planning. In late July, Buliosi received disturbing intelligence from a family member in San Francisco. The family wasn't just planning to break Manson out of prison within a month. They were stockpiling weapons. They had rented a house in South Los Angeles. They were hiding an escaped convict. And once Manson was free, Helter Skelter would really start. The revolution would be on. Buliosi passed the information along to LAPD. When he did, he learned that among the witnesses Manson had called in the Hinman Shea trial was a Folsom convict named Kenneth Como, also known by the colorful AKA Jesse James. Though it hadn't been publicized when brought to Los Angeles less than a week before, Como had managed to escape from the Hall of Records. LAPD doubted, however, that he was still in the area. LAPD was skeptical. These were just kids, they said. Troubled young people who had gotten caught up in something bigger than themselves. How dangerous could they really be? But Buliosi knew better. He had seen what these kids were capable of. He had prosecuted them for some of the most brutal murders in American history. And he understood something that law enforcement was only beginning to grasp. The most dangerous criminals are often the ones who believe they're fighting for a cause. On schedule, less than a month later, the Manson family made their move. Picture this. It's a Saturday night in Hawthorne, California. The Western surplus store has just closed for the day. The streets are quiet. Then, just around closing time, 6 figures approached the store. What happened next was like something out of a Hollywood action movie, except the stakes were real and the consequences were deadly. The 6 robbers burst into the store. One held a shotgun on the clerk and 2 customers, while the others began systematically loading weapons into a van parked in the alley. Rifles, shotguns, pistols, they were building an arsenal. They had collected about 140 guns when they spotted the first police car. LAPD had been alerted by a silent alarm and had already surrounded the building. The robbers came out shooting. For 10 minutes, gunfire echoed through the streets of Hawthorne. The van was riddled with over 50 bullets. Police cars were destroyed. It was a miracle no one was killed. When the smoke cleared, all 6 robbers were in custody. Every single one of them was a Manson family member. Mary Brunner, the very first person to join Manson's cult. Catherine Scher, known as Gypsy. Dennis Rice, Lawrence Bailey, and Kenneth Como, the escaped convict who had been hiding in their safe house. After their arrest, it was learned that the same group was also responsible for the robbery of a Covina beer distributorship on August 13th, which netted them $2,600. The authorities thought they understood the plan. The family was going to storm the courthouse when Manson appeared as a witness in another trial. It would be a commando-style raid, they said. A dramatic rescue attempt. But they were wrong. The real plan was far more audacious. And we'll find out about that after this quick break. Remember that airplane scenario I described at the beginning? That wasn't just a dramatic setup. That was the Manson family's actual plan. According to a family member who was involved in the planning, the weapons from the Hawthorne robbery weren't meant for a courthouse raid. They were meant for something much more spectacular and terrifying. The plan was to hijack a 747 jumbo jet. Once in control of the aircraft, they would kill 1 passenger every hour until Charles Manson and all imprisoned family members were released. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a plan that would have turned hundreds of innocent people into hostages. A plan that would have brought the country to its knees through sheer terror. A plan that with enough public pressure and media attention just might have worked. This wasn't just about freeing their leader. This was about proving to the world that the Manson family was still a force to be reckoned with. That prison bars couldn't contain their influence. That their revolution was far from over. It was a plan so audacious, so terrifying in its implications, that it remained classified for years. The public was never told how close they came to witnessing the most spectacular hijacking in American history. It's October 20th, 1971, and the sun hasn't yet risen over downtown Los Angeles. Inside the supposedly impenetrable Hall of Justice on the 13th floor, a convicted killer named Kenneth is methodically sawing through steel bars with nothing but a hacksaw. Below him, 12 floors of concrete and steel separate him from freedom. Above him, nothing but Los Angeles sky. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. Como isn't just any escaped convict. He's a member of the Manson family. And this breakout, it's happening right in the middle of what Prosecutor Vincent Buliosi would later call one of the most dangerous trials in LA County history. Vincent Buliosi had just finished prosecuting the most infamous murder case in American history, the Manson family murders. But his work with Charles Manson and his followers was far from over. Now the state was preparing to try several family members for a seemingly smaller crime, the robbery of a Hawthorne gun store. What should have been a routine armed robbery trial was about to become something unprecedented in American jurisprudence. Judge Arthur Alarcon looked out over his courtroom and made a statement that would send chills through the Los Angeles legal community. He was about to oversee, in his words, the biggest collection of murderers in Los Angeles County at one time. Think about that for a moment. In one room, under one roof, the defense had called 12 convicted killers to testify. Not alleged killers, not suspected killers, convicted killers. And at the center of this deadly constellation, Charles Manson himself, along with Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Steve Grogan, and Bruce Davis, names that had become synonymous with the most brutal murders of the 1960s. The security measures were extraordinary. Armed guards at every entrance, metal detectors, background checks on every person entering the building. But as events would soon prove, even extraordinary wasn't enough. Let's go back to that October morning. Kenneth, you will remember, is the convict who escaped from these same halls of justice a few months earlier and joined the Manson family members in the Hawthorne robbery for which he was now being tried. He also had escaped from prison 3 other times since 1956. Somehow he'd gotten his hands on a hacksaw in a maximum security facility. Somehow he'd managed to cut through reinforced steel bars without anyone noticing. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Como didn't just walk out of his cell. He had to climb down 5 floors on a rope made of bed sheets. 5 floors. In the dark, with no guarantee the makeshift rope would hold. When he reached the 8th floor, he didn't head for the nearest exit. Instead, he kicked in a window to Department 104, the very courtroom where Buliosi had prosecuted Manson and his 3 female co-defendants just months earlier. Was this symbolic? A message? Or just the quickest route to freedom? Como made his way down the stairs and walked out of the Hall of Justice like he owned the place. And waiting for him in the family van was Sandra Good, Sandy, one of Manson's most devoted followers. For 7 hours, Kenneth was free. 7 hours during which law enforcement had no idea where a convicted killer with ties to the most dangerous cult in America had gone. 7 hours during which the people of Los Angeles were unknowingly sharing their streets with a fugitive who had literally sawed his way to freedom. Sheriff's deputies said 31, was arrested in a residential area of West Hollywood where he had been the object of a massive door-to-door manhunt in a 6-block residential area. Over 100 deputies took part in the search. Deputies said was found hiding in a small shed behind a garage by Deputy Roger Anderson. Anderson said offered no resistance and had no weapons. The deputy said he just opened the door of the shed and shouted, "Freeze! Come out!" He said Como uttered a brief obscenity when he surrendered. But here's where this story takes a truly bizarre turn. When Como was finally recaptured, the authorities rounded up the usual suspects: Squeaky Fromm, Brenda McCann, Catherine Gypsy Share, and other family members. They arrested them on suspicion of aiding and abetting the escape. Yet they had to release them. Why? Because despite the obvious coordination, Sandy waiting with the van, the other family members' convenient presence in the area, there was no positive proof of conspiracy. This is where Irving Kanarek enters our story. Kanarek was Sandra Good's defense attorney, and if you knew the Manson case, you knew Kanarek. He was the lawyer who had turned the original Manson trial into a circus with his endless objections and theatrical antics. When Como's escape was discovered, Kanarek appeared in Judge Raymond Choate's courtroom and made a statement that was audacious even by his standards. He alleged, with no proof at this particular time, that the escape had been deliberately allowed to take place. Judge Choate, probably wondering if he was living in some alternate reality, asked the obvious question. If the authorities had deliberately allowed the escape, why would they force Como to climb down 5 floors on a rope made of bedsheets? Kanarek's response? That makes it look good, Your Honor. While the escape dominated headlines, something even more sinister was happening behind the scenes. The trial was proceeding, but the jury, 12 ordinary citizens doing their civic duty, was under attack. 2 jurors had to be replaced with alternates. Why? Because they'd received telephone threats. Not just any threats, death threats. The message was clear: vote for conviction and you die. The calls were traced to an unidentified female family member. Think about the psychological warfare at play here. These weren't random crank calls. These were targeted threats from people who had already proven they were capable of murder. The jurors knew who Susan Atkins was. They knew what Patricia Krenwinkel had done. They knew the family's capacity for violence wasn't theoretical. It was documented in blood. How do you deliberate fairly when you know that the wrong verdict might mean your death? How do you weigh evidence when the defendant's associates are literally threatening to kill you? Despite the escape, despite the death threats, despite the circus atmosphere, the trial moved forward. The defendants faced 2 counts of armed robbery, and the justice system was determined to prove it couldn't be intimidated. Bruce Rice, perhaps the smartest of the bunch, pleaded guilty and was sent to state prison. The others rolled the dice with a jury trial and lost. The sentences reflected the seriousness of their crimes and the danger they posed to society. Robert Lovett received 2 consecutive 5-year-to-life terms. Catherine Share got 10 years to life. Kenneth Como, the man who had sought his way to temporary freedom, received 15 years to life. Mary Brunner and Steve Bailey each got 20 years to life. Sandra Good, the woman who had waited in the family van, was eventually tried for aiding and abetting an escape. Her lawyer, Irving Kanarek, claimed she had been kidnapped by Como. The jury didn't buy it. Sandy got 6 months in jail, a relatively light sentence that seemed almost insulting given the chaos she had helped create. The Hawthorne trial ended, but its implications lingered. For the first time in American legal history, a major trial had been disrupted by an escape from what was supposed to be an escape-proof facility. For the first time, jurors in a criminal trial had been replaced because of death threats from the defendant's associates. Vincent Buliosi had spent months prosecuting the Manson family for their most heinous crimes, but it was this smaller case, this simple armed robbery, that showed him just how far the family's reach extended. They could strike anywhere, anytime, even from behind bars. The Hall of Justice eventually upgraded its security. New procedures were implemented, stronger bars were installed, but the psychological damage was done. The myth of the impregnable courthouse had been shattered by a hacksaw and a rope made of bed sheets. Today, as we look back on the Manson family cases, we often focus on the murders, the brutal killings that shocked the world. But perhaps we should also remember the Hawthorne trial, because it showed us something equally disturbing: how terror can reach beyond prison walls, beyond courtroom doors and into the very heart of our justice system. Kenneth Como's 7 hours of freedom lasted less than a day. But the questions his escape raised about security, about justice, about the price of holding the most dangerous criminals accountable, those questions echo still. Some escapes are about freedom. Others are about sending a message. Como's breakout was both, a desperate bid for liberty and a chilling reminder that even behind bars, the family's capacity for chaos remained unbroken. The Hawthorne trial proved that sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't just the ones who commit murder. Sometimes they're the ones who make us question whether justice itself can survive their presence. Imagine walking into a courtroom and having the most notorious killer in American history send you a message through a bailiff. Not a threat, not a curse, but a request. He wants to talk to you. Personally, privately. Now imagine that this killer is Charles Manson, and you're the prosecutor who just sent him to death row for 7 murders. This is exactly what happened to Vincent Buliosi on June 14, 1971, and we'll find out about it after this quick break. What began as a routine court appearance turned into one of the most extraordinary conversations in criminal justice history. An hour-and-a-half face-to-face dialogue between a mass murderer and the man who had convicted him. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. When that conversation sparked controversy, when lawyers complained and judges demanded answers, Charles Manson himself took the witness stand to defend the prosecutor who had put him away for life. June 1971. Charles Manson was back in court, this time facing trial for the murders of Gary Hinman and Donald Shorty Shea. For Vincent Buliosi, it was a chance to sit back and watch, a welcome relief from the grueling months he'd spent prosecuting Manson for the Tate LaBianca murders. But as Buliosi settled into the spectator section, something caught his attention. Manson had recently begun wearing what could only be described as a black stormtrooper's uniform to court. The symbolism was unmistakable and unsettling. Then came the message. A bailiff approached Buliosi with an unexpected request. Charles Manson wanted to speak with him. Not through lawyers, not through intermediaries, face to face. Most prosecutors would have walked away. After all, what could the man who had orchestrated some of the most brutal murders in American history possibly have to say? But Buliosi was intrigued. He had questions of his own. Questions about Manson's twisted philosophy, about the influences that had shaped his worldview. So when court recessed at 4:30 that afternoon, Buliosi stayed. What happened next would shock the legal community and reveal Charles Manson in a way the public had never seen before. Picture this scene, a nearly empty courtroom, shadows lengthening as the day ended. In the prisoner's dock sat Charles Manson, still in his stormtrooper uniform. Across from him, the prosecutor who had just secured his death sentence. Between them, a bailiff named Rusty Burrell, who found the conversation so fascinating he stayed overtime to listen. For an hour and a half, these two men talked. Not about the current charges, not about legal strategy. They discussed philosophy, religion, and the twisted ideology that had led to 7 brutal murders. But first, Manson wanted Buliosi to know something crucial. I don't have no hard feelings. Think about that. Here was a man facing life in prison, or worse, telling his prosecutor that there were no hard feelings. Manson actually praised Buliosi's work, calling it a fantastic, remarkable job. He acknowledged that Buliosi had given him a fair trial, like he had promised. But here's where the conversation takes a chilling turn. Manson wasn't bitter about the result because, in his words, prison has always been my home. I didn't want to leave it the last time, and you're only sending me back there. He spoke of prison like others might describe a vacation resort. Regular meals? Not great, but better than the garbage at Spawn Ranch. No work if you didn't want to. Plenty of time to play guitar. It was a twisted perspective that revealed just how institutionalized Manson had become. When Buliosi pointed out that prison meant no women, Manson's response was equally disturbing. I don't need broads. Every woman I ever had, she asked me to make love to her. I never asked them. I can do without them. There was plenty of sex in prison, he claimed, with a casualness that made the statement even more unsettling. As their conversation continued, Manson began to reveal things he had never admitted in open court. While he still blamed the Beatles' music and LSD for the Tate LaBianca murders, he made a stunning admission. He had known they were going to happen. "I even knew what the mice were doing at Spawn Ranch," he told Buliosi, claiming an almost supernatural awareness of everything around him. Then came the closest thing to a confession anyone would ever get from Charles Manson. "So I said to them, 'Here, do you want this rope? Do you want this gun?' And later I told them not to tell anyone about what happened." These weren't the words of an innocent man wrongly convicted. These were the words of someone who had orchestrated murder with the casual efficiency of someone organizing a dinner party. The conversation turned to race, and Manson's true feelings emerged. Though careful never to use such language in open court, he repeatedly used racial slurs in their private conversation. Yet he claimed not to hate anyone. "I don't hate anyone, but I know they hate me." When Buliosi brought up Helter Skelter, Manson's apocalyptic vision of a race war, Manson made another chilling admission. Asked when he thought the black man was going to take over, Manson replied, "I may have put a clog in them," implying that he disrupted their uprising. "You mean the trial alerted Whitey?" Buliosi asked. Manson's response was simple and in its own way deeply sad. "Yeah!" Here was a man who had orchestrated brutal murders, partly to start a race war, now admitting that the very trial meant to bring him to justice might have disrupted his twisted plans. Word of the conversation leaked, and the legal community erupted. How could a prosecutor meet privately with a defendant he had just convicted? Was this ethical? Was it legal? Had Buliosi crossed a line? The following day, one of the attorneys filed a complaint, and Judge Raymond Choate ordered an evidentiary hearing in open court. This was serious business. A prosecutor's career could be destroyed by allegations of impropriety. Buliosi took the stand and testified about their conversation. He was careful to note that Manson had requested the meeting, not him. He emphasized that they hadn't discussed the current charges. He pointed out that he had even told Irving Kanarek, Manson's attorney, about the request, but Kanarek had simply walked away. Bailiff Rusty Burrell supported Buliosi's account, confirming every detail of their testimony. But the real surprise came next. Charles Manson himself took the witness stand, not to attack the prosecutor who had convicted him, but to defend him. "The version the man gave was right on," Manson testified, pointing at Buliosi. "I am almost sure Mr. Kanarek knew that I had asked to see him. I had wanted to speak to this man for the last year, and it was my request that motivated it." Think about the bizarreness of this moment. America's most notorious criminal was under oath, defending the integrity of the man who had sent him to death row. Manson even took responsibility for any controversy. "Your Honor, I don't think this is fair at all. You know this was my mistake." Judge Choate agreed, ruling that there had been no impropriety. The hearing ended, but the questions it raised would linger for years. The press had a field day with the story. Headlines across the country captured the incredulity of the situation. Manson defends his prosecutor. Killer takes stand for DA. Manson, Buliosi gave me fair trial. How do you explain such a moment to the public? How do you make sense of a mass murderer vouching for the ethical conduct of the man who had destroyed his life? Some saw it as manipulation, Manson playing one final mind game, trying to create chaos even from behind bars. Others viewed it as a twisted form of respect, a killer's acknowledgement of superior legal skill. But perhaps the truth was simpler and more disturbing. Perhaps Charles Manson genuinely respected Vincent Buliosi because Buliosi had done something few people in Manson's life had ever done. He had treated him fairly, held him accountable, and followed through on his promises. In Manson's warped worldview, this might have been the closest thing to genuine human connection he had experienced in years. The conversation between Vincent Buliosi and Charles Manson lasted an hour and a half, but its implications stretched far beyond that single afternoon in June 1971. It revealed the complexity of justice, the strange psychology of criminal minds, and the unexpected moments when truth emerges from the most unlikely sources. Buliosi learned things about the Manson murders that day that would never come out in any trial. He heard admissions that came closer to confession than anything Manson would ever say in open court. He glimpsed the twisted logic that had motivated some of the most brutal crimes in American history. But perhaps most importantly, he witnessed something that challenged every assumption about criminals and their relationship to justice. When push came to shove, when his prosecutor's reputation was on the line, Charles Manson chose truth over revenge, honesty over manipulation. Was it genuine respect? A final manipulation? A moment of unexpected integrity from a man who had shown precious little of it in his life? We may never know. What we do know is this. On June 15th, 1971, the most notorious killer in American history took an oath to tell the truth and used that oath to defend the man who had convicted him of 7 murders. It was a moment that defied logic, challenged assumptions, and revealed the strange, sometimes incomprehensible nature of human psychology. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that day. In a world where Charles Manson had turned everything upside down, where peace and love had been twisted into murder and chaos, perhaps it was fitting that his final courtroom appearance would be equally paradoxical. The killer defending his prosecutor, truth emerging from the mouth of a madman. Sometimes the most extraordinary moments in criminal justice aren't about solving cases or securing convictions. Sometimes they're about those rare instances when the masks come off, when the games stop, and when even the most twisted minds reveal unexpected glimpses of something resembling honor. Charles Manson may have been many things. Killer, cult leader, manipulator. But that day in court, he was something else entirely. A witness to the truth. The Hawthorne robbery ended the Manson family's most ambitious escape attempt, but it also revealed something crucial about the nature of extremist movements. Even behind bars, even with their leaders imprisoned, the true believers never stopped believing. They never stopped planning. They never stopped looking for ways to spread their message of chaos and destruction. Vincent Buliosi spent years prosecuting the Manson family, but he understood that the real victory wasn't just in securing convictions. It was in exposing the true nature of what they were dealing with. These weren't just criminals. They were terrorists who used fear and violence to advance their twisted ideology. The hijacking plot was foiled by a silent alarm and quick police response. But it makes you wonder, how many other plots were never discovered? How many other plans were made in the shadows, whispered in prison cells, or planned in safe houses across the country? The Manson family trials officially ended in 1971, but their legacy of violence and extremism continues to this day. They showed the world that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who believe they're fighting for something bigger than themselves. And sometimes the most terrifying crimes are the ones that never happen at all. In our next episode, we'll look at the events after the trials up to the present day. But in the meantime, after this quick break, we'll get expert analysis from our 2 crime experts, Simon and Tom.
Tom, I can't believe we're at episode 29 here. It's just flown in, this Manson case. Alec, what a fantastic job you've done again. The 30 episodes it looks like we're going to end up with here are a fantastic piece of work of reference, I would suggest, Tom, from all sorts of angles. But episode 29, we'll stick with that just now. It started with this escape plan that we didn't hear much about, but came out later on. What surprised me here, Tom, was okay, we've been surprised all the way along by the depth of the case, by the variety of witnesses, the stardom of the day and some of the stars that were involved. We were up until a certain point by Manson's behaviour, but we're not surprised by that now because we kind of know what to expect from him. But the final surprise for me here was the aftermath of the trial. Nothing's changed. The family continue. They want to get Charlie out. They want to keep the whole ethos of the family and his whole movement. They want to keep it going.
Yeah, I wrote 2 words to distinguish: true believers. True believers. And they really are. They're disciples. in a very sense. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that Charlie has cast himself as Jesus Christ. He even calls himself that.
Yeah.
He has these fanatical believers. And it doesn't matter what the circumstances are, they're still there and operating. I've had in my mind just to do a sort of critique of this case and say, what are the learning points? One of the big learning points for me is that law enforcement and the justice system in California never saw the full scale and scope of this, and they never got to grips with it at all.
We've said a few times during the course of this, Tom, that Manson and his followers didn't bend to the system. They didn't come dressed for court. They didn't moderate their behaviour in court or try to make themselves out as victims. They were very young, remember, these girls as well. They could have played it differently. Once they're found guilty and sentenced to death, the whole movement becomes reinvigorated. Now we can see the threats being made to the jury, the threats being made to Buliosi himself. The shaved heads are prominent now. They come out their shell a wee bit now, and the violence that they threaten is very much in the forefront, especially with this robbery that they were planning, stealing the firearms for, etc.
I think that's right. I think there's a fine balance. You see it in the news today where the more you oppress people, the more reaction and response you get. Yeah. So if you bomb a place and if you shoot so many people, it's a recruiting sergeant. But I still say, Simon, in your and our experience, when we had a big drug trial or a big terrorist trial, we always scoped what the consequences would be. Would be out with the court.
Yes.
And we put in place gangland trials, likewise. We put in place measures of mitigation. This was never done in this case. No. Never done. These people were camped outside the court, shouting abuse at people. They were intimidating witnesses in the case, driving by and shouting abuse and making threats and all this stuff. Now, I say again, I say again, Buliosi, look, all credit to the man, all credit to him in bringing this home. It was despite law enforcement, not because of it, opinion, but overall, they just never saw the big picture or gripped it. Nobody seemed to grip it. Buliosi couldn't do it. He was fighting the case in the court. But somebody else, the Commissioner of Police, I would suggest to you, the California Attorney General, there would be an Attorney General, they should have gripped this and seen it for what it was, and it was never done. And I agree with you that these people got worse and the disciples continued to operate, and the whole thing sort of began like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but nothing was done to prevent it.
No. And even Manson in court starts threatening the media. I've told my people to start killing you. They're just getting bolder and bolder. And I would suggest that's because of what you're saying, Tom, that no one was really clamping down and paying attention. And in amongst it all, we've got another trial. There's lots of trials now. I thought the end of the Manson main trial, the Tate murders, would be the end of it, but it's not. There's lots of trials that come out of this now for all the peripherals. This Tex Watson trial, he did try to play the cards. He did put a suit on and get his hair cut and try to make out that he was some kind of victim. I was going to speak to you about diminished capacity. That's something that we have here in the UK as well, but we call it diminished responsibility. Did you have much dealings with that in any of the big trials that you had?
Yeah, it was a standard card people would play, and of course it always ended up badly for them. And I remember speaking to a young man who had stabbed someone in the street, and he was saying, I'm going for diminished responsibility.
Yeah.
And I said, listen, you'll end up in Carstairs, detained without limit of time. Her Majesty's pleasure. And I said, and you'll never get out. I said, if you just stand up and take it, then you'll be out in 12 years or whatever. It'd been a fight gone wrong. He wasn't entirely to blame, but he was left.
You'll have some future.
He was left holding the knife. And they made this mistake time and time again. And years later, I'm talking, 25 years later, I came across the same guy and he said, what's your 10-year advice? He was in Carstairs for 15 years.
Did you meet him at an appointment, Tom? In a clinic?
I was actually recruiting surveillance officers. The point is that and you don't get out of these places. Carstairs, by the way, for our listeners who are not in Scotland, is the state mental hospital. But you don't get out of there direct. What happens is you serve your sentence there, and if they consider you're fit to be released, and remember that you've pled guilty to have diminished responsibility, so you've labelled yourself.
Yes.
If they
Unstable.
consider you fit to be released, then they release you into a prison for further. So it's a stepped process. You don't just get out after a certain amount of time. And of course, some people don't get out at all.
Thanks, Tom. I mentioned the shooting. We should explain a wee bit of that story because it's very interesting that they planned this robbery to hijack an airplane, a 747, and then use the leverage of being in the air, kill a hostage every hour until all of their friends, all of the family, including Manson, were released from prison. This robbery, that the shootout they had, it resulted in a shootout in this place called Hawthorne.
Yeah, that was very much in vogue. Aeroplane hijacking had a very short lifespan because, of course, they closed it down very, very quickly, introduced air marshals, and you couldn't get into cabin, you couldn't get into the flight cabin of planes, etc. But there was a while where it was all the rage by Middle Eastern terrorists, mainly, but also by opportunists and sometimes by criminals. Sometimes just people. There was a very famous case, remember the famous D.B. Cooper, which nobody's really ever really tracked down or bottomed out. And nobody really knows who he really was. That was the name he gave. He basically extorted his some of money and then parachuted out of an aircraft over the remotest part of North America and disappeared into a snowstorm. The chances of him surviving were incredibly small. They did find some of the money that he'd taken had been found in some remote place, so I don't think he did survive it.
I think we covered this earlier this year, Tom, at the start of the year. We covered this in one of our seasons.
We did indeed. And if you give us a minute before the end of the episode, we'll find the episode where we referred to it. Yeah. But the point I'm making is that skyjacking, as it was called, was all the rage at that time, and they were trying to jump on the bandwagon.
I remember in the 80s there was a famous one where terrorists had taken possession of the plane and it was on the tarmac. Maggie Thatcher sent in SAS, didn't she? The philosophy was, we can't let this continue. We've got to just wipe this out and make a statement right now that this is going to get you nowhere. Yeah. Something that Thatcher, lover or hater, was very good at.
You're not going to succeed. You're not going home. No. The thing about this group of people, and Charlie Manson himself, actually, he wanted to die. He saw this as the fulfillment of his prophecy. And of course, he saw that as being a judicial killing, a judicial crucifixion, if you like. And he saw, and of course, what that means is, and what you saw in this case, is that the family never stopped planning, they never stopped trying, and they never stopped believing. Judicial process and getting arrested and imprisoned and being in prison for long, long periods of time did not seem to affect that at all. And they always seemed to have a means of communication, both between each other and externally. Now, they were all in different places scattered across California, but that didn't seem to stop them. They seemed to manage to overcome that. And again, this comes down to this overall issue about who was looking at the big picture, the really big picture here, and who was gripping it. And it appears that no one was.
What did you make of Judge Alexander, Tom, in the Tex Watson trial? If what we can believe, and we only know what Alec has dug up and what he's sourced and evidenced, but Judge Alexander wasn't exactly neutral, was he, in the trial of Tex Watson?
No, but I think you've got to remember, I've got American in-laws, and in fact, my daughter-in-law's father was a judge. And I've spoken to him a long time about this. And many judicial appointments are political. If you've got a Democratic governor and you're a qualified lawyer, you can be appointed to the bench without necessarily going through all the processes we would expect sheriffs to go through, you know? I mean, in our system, you're appointed a temporary sheriff, usually after an extensive period of work. Sometimes there's a prominent defence or a prosecutor.
Yeah.
But over there, it's not like that. And some judges are appointed politically, and therefore
Right.
you're going to get a much more mixed bag in terms of quality. But I'm going to come back to it in my summary later on, Simon. But the judge in the main trial didn't acquit himself well,
No.
for me. And I couldn't help but reflect on some of the High Court judges we worked with, the likes of Wheatley and Cameron and these people, who just would not have tolerated the kind of circus that the trial became. And that's what it was. It was a three-ring circus.
Just to finish on episode 29, Tom, there was one thing I wanted to mention to you that was niggling my mind. And I don't know what your take on it will be. That's why I'm going to ask you. Escapees. And it was the case here that I'm talking to you about escapees from prison primarily, or police custody for that matter. I seem to have dealt with a lot of these during my career. We were called upon quite a lot to assist with escapees because of the geography more than anything else. Is there a policy to keep escaped prisoners under wraps from the general public? You would know this as a deputy chief constable. It seems that there's less publicity about escaped prisoners than I remember that there actually were escaped prisoners.
It depends on the category of the prisoner. I mean,
Right.
it's as simple as that. In the mayhem, which is the sheriff's summary court on a Monday morning, the custody court, there's people being led about all over the place. Sometimes they don't have two guards with them. They want to go to the toilet. They want to tie their shoelaces. They've got to go for medication. It's little wonder that one or two don't slip away. And because they're being escorted by, not by police officers, remember. They're being escorted by civilian court staff.
Yes.
And to be honest, if they are non-violent, low category prisoners, I would not expect, and I know in fact they don't put out a general release about escaped prisoners. For a start, sometimes if a prisoner escapes, manages to slide through a side door, it's quite some time until they realise they're not there.
Yeah.
You know? It's often not a case of them knocking over their guard and vaulting the fence.
So it's not a case of escaping as being lost property.
Well, it's precisely lost in the system. You know, Simon, we in our service dealt with a court system which was juggling priorities. And I'm not going to be critical of the court system because they were good people and they were trying their best, but they had hugely overworked caseloads and under-resourced. It's fully worse now.
Yes. Yeah.
It's fully worse now. Simon, we have the incredible case of Kenneth, the multiple escaper. He's an escape artist. And somehow it's arranged for that Manson will call him as a witness. Now, there is no apparent reason what he would be speaking to as a witness. But of course, you and I both know that in capital cases and very serious cases, there's a lot of benefit of the doubt given to the accused. They can call who they want. And so he was called as a witness, but it was a complete sham because it was actually only to facilitate yet another escape attempt. So here we see again, what's beneath that, of course, is the fact that Manson's communicating, planning and plotting, as I've just said, to actually bring about this escape.
Yeah, it's loose, isn't it? Also, lack of control at every stage. What you want to avoid is someone saying that they weren't allowed to defend themselves properly. Every decision made by the judge and the Crown is gauged towards thinking there might be an appeal after a guilty verdict that you hope for, some escape route that you've left open. So there is a lot of leeway given, especially in what was a capital case at the time.
Yeah, and let's not forget that the pardon or the death penalty pardon goes to the governor of the state, who is another political appointee. So the less loopholes you leave, the better. And I think Buliosi would be very conscious of that in what had been the most complicated and complex trial. Unnecessarily so, but he had dealt with it, a complex and complicated trial. He wasn't going to allow some little loose end to allow the governor, whoever it was, to give Manson or any of the family the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's why he would be doing it.
Yeah. Again, Tom, episode 29, there's so much detail in there. It's fascinating. And I find myself re-listening to bits of it because the detail is just so... Alec has done such a fantastic job of doing that. But we'll go on to episode 30. Episode 30 is going to bring the whole thing to a conclusion for us here, and we'll hear a wee bit about the aftermath of this, Tom, if there is such a thing. We'll speak soon.
Take care.